Great, thanks. So this is the last day of our elevation certificate series. Today we'll look at section C, D, and then a little bit on H and I. So in case you weren't able to catch the previous sessions, what is the elevation certificate? It is an official FEMA document that certifies and verifies elevations of the different structural aspects of an existing structure or one that is under construction, and it pertains to compliance for floodplain management, that the applicant is adhering to federal, state, and local requirements. And so these are documents that are only for structures. They can be used to support a letter of map change application, but it would be just for the structure and not any of the surrounding land. They are required for new or substantially improved structures, and they must be a finished certificate for that. And there are uses for the under construction certificate, and we'll get into that a little bit, but by the very end, we need a finished certificate based on finished construction. And so in Kansas, it has to be done by either a surveyor or an engineer. Our architects are not allowed to fill them out. And then the form is not mandated by FEMA, but there's really no reason not to use it or try to reinvent the wheel. It has all of the documentation that you would need to, or most of the information that you would need to approve a permit. And then once an elevation certificate is certified, it doesn't ever expire, even if the form that it's on expires. As long as that was the valid form at the time that it was certified, it does not ever expire. It can only be invalidated by changes to the actual structure. So this was released in 2022, but there were some formatting issues with it that were causing problems. And so on November 6th, they re-released it with some of those corrections. They allow now alphanumeric entries. There's no automatic rounding. That was an issue. Surveyors adding their digital signatures would lock the document, and it still kind of does that, but there's workarounds for that. The instruction button, you can toggle back and forth between the instructions and the form. Line A6 specifies that photos must be in color. H1A removed the word subgrade, and then there's updates also to the current floodproofing certificate. So basically, if you have a copy from when it was first released, you might want to go back and download it again if your copy is from before November 6th of 2023. So who can complete by section? I have crossed out the sections that we've already covered this week. So we are focusing on section C for the most part, and this is the section for the licensed surveyor or engineer to put their certified elevations in that section, and then that gets certified in the comments section in part D. And so you do have to be licensed to fill those parts out. And then sections H and I are only for insurance, and anyone can fill those out. So section C, like I said, this is the building elevation information. So this is an area that has either a base flood elevation calculated or the flood depth has been indicated for a zone AO. Again, it has to be by a licensed professional. C2 clarifies that it can be used for AO or A99, and that is different from the previous form. There's now a conversion factor checkbox so that you don't miss that in case you have forgotten to do a conversion or to indicate that you have. So if yes, it asks you to describe the source of that conversion factor in section D comments, and these are just kind of prompts and reminders so that this doesn't get overlooked and you don't get mismatched datums, because that will cause issues. And so they've basically rewritten the form to try to avoid those common mistakes that we were seeing previously. It can be used to determine first floor height for insurance in any zone. And so a property owner that does have certified elevations can use that, and FEMA will look at that and compare it to what they've come up with for the first floor height, and whichever one is more beneficial to the property owner, that's what they'll use. The attached garage goes in C2D, and that is different from an enclosure. And so we'll look at those because sometimes enclosures are used as a garage, even though they're not considered an attached garage. Let's see. C2C, it used to say only for V zones, and that was removed because if you have a diagram 5 that's elevated on post piers or columns and there's no enclosure, it's just completely open, you can add that information in, which might be useful for floodplain administrators to look at what the lowest horizontal structural member is. So that's just more information that can be added there. And you don't have to be in the V zone, which is coastal, so we don't have those. And then C2F, H, and G, or G and H, yeah, the lowest and highest adjacent grade, and they've now distinguished between those being natural or finished, meaning fill. So that's a change from the previous form, and also helpful information for insurance and the floodplain administrator. And so as we work with applicants or developers, it's really important to distinguish what these different terms mean because they don't mean the same thing, even though sometimes they can coincide. So the bottom floor is the lowest enclosed space, such as a basement, which is always the lowest floor, but it's also the bottom floor, or a crawl space, which is always the bottom floor, but not necessarily the lowest floor. So whatever the lowest floor of the structure is, that's the bottom floor. Whether it's finished or unfinished, it doesn't really matter. That is determined by the structure features itself, and the surveyor documents that. So whatever that is, that goes into C2A, which is the top of the bottom floor. Versus the lowest floor, that is a floodplain management term. It's not determined by the surveyor. It's the lowest enclosed area, including a basement, but does not include other types of compliant enclosures that are not part of the living space. They are elevating that living space, and allowing, floodwaters to move freely in and out. And it's only used for parking, storage, or building access. That is a compliant enclosure and is not considered the lowest floor. And so this is determined by the community official using the elevation certificate and other documentation. So understanding this and explaining it to property owners, because these terms may seem interchangeable to people when they're not, and they mean very different things at times. So for instance, we had a floodplain administrator who had this discussion with an applicant who then proceeded to put in a basement well below the base flood elevation. And when they did inspections, they were like, well, the lowest floor is supposed to be 1 foot above the base flood elevation. And he pointed at the basement ceiling and said, yeah, it is. Where the basement floor is going to be the lowest floor no matter what. And that's why basements aren't allowed. So miscommunication in that way can cause big mistakes, and that's another part of why doing inspections is so important during construction when things can be fixed at a low cost. And then first floor height is an insurance term. It only pertains to insurance, and that is what FEMA is using to rate insurance policies. It's at or above grade only, and it's the first floor that is at or above grade, regardless of whether there's a basement or any other features or characteristics of the structure. Those are considered, but for first floor height, this element that goes into rating that premium, it's only for insurance. And so that's what section H and I are for. Those are the new sections to this version of the form, and that section is only used for insurance, or it could be interpreted from section C if they have had a survey done, or section E, that's only for AO zones, and either the property owner or the community official can fill that section out, and that's for that shallow flooding zone. So yeah, understanding the difference between what these three terms mean and what they refer to is important. So as I mentioned, garage versus enclosure. Sometimes an enclosure is used as a garage, as you can see on the right side. So that's the full story enclosure, diagram 7. And so you can use that enclosure for parking, storage, or building access, but it's elevating the living part of that structure. So the lowest floor is above that. Again, that's the floodplain management term, whereas the bottom floor is the bottom of that enclosure. And so that's considered an enclosure, whereas on the left, you have the attached garage, which is adjacent to the living area and it's structurally connected, but it's not elevating any part of the structure. And so that's the difference between an attached garage, and obviously the bottom and lowest floor for a slab on grade are the same floor because there's nothing beneath it. It's not being elevated by anything but a concrete slab. So there's no enclosure here. And that's just important to understand the difference between the two because of how that information is entered into section C. So again, just to, I guess, bring this home, the lowest floor of the lowest enclosed area, including a basement, in unfinished or flood-resistant enclosure that's used only for parking, storage, or building access, in any area other than a basement is not the lowest floor, provided that it's not in violation of the regulations. So if the lowest enclosed area is used for anything other than parking, building access, or storage, it's considered the lowest floor. And that could happen if someone converts an enclosure to living space or blocks the flood vents or something like that. Then it becomes the lowest floor and is usually then in violation. And the floor of the basement is always the lowest floor, regardless of how it's used, whether it's finished or unfinished. It's always the lowest floor. So line C1 is building elevations are based on drawings. Is it under construction or is it the finished construction? As I mentioned, the finished construction is always required at the end, but requiring an under construction certificate is also useful if you do that. That way you can make sure as you go through the construction and inspection process that we're verifying these elevations before things are complete. You don't want to wait until you get the finished construction and other documents to find that a mistake has been made, because then it's very expensive to fix. Yeah, so you might consider requiring that as part of the permitting process. And then line C2, so the elevations, and it lists the zones, and the BFE that goes back into section B, which we talked about yesterday. And so at this point, you have the benchmark that you're using as well as the vertical datum. So the unique identifier for the benchmark is registered through the National Geodetic Service, and it's the permanent ID. So you can check with the maintainer. They have a website where they have all of this mapped out, and you can find where the different benchmarks are located and maintained. So this is a much improvement since the 90s, when the firm would just kind of list where the benchmark is supposed to be, and it would be like a nail in a tree or some kind of marking on a bridge or something like that. Now they're digitally maintained so that you can locate them and know that they're reliable. So the vertical datum for the benchmark elevation for the elevations in section C must be in the same datum as the base flood elevation. So if you do have to do a conversion because it's an older map, perhaps then you would need to indicate what software was used and some additional information in the comments section, and you can read through the instructions. They're very thorough on what should go in the comments section, and this is definitely one of them. And like I said, they kind of put this in as a checklist mechanism so that this doesn't get missed, because again, mismatched datums would not be good. So the GPS survey, you would indicate the benchmark for that base station. And then if you're using Opus, and I have a slide on what that is a little bit further on, you want to attach the Opus report to the certificate. or the real-time network that was used. So in addition to comments, there are also some attachments that should be included in the comments, or to the, sorry, attachments to the certificate. So this is the NGS website, so you can see all the information they have here, data sheets, you can download shape files. They have the interactive map there where you can find benchmarks that are close to you. And there's lots of information here, so it's very well maintained. FEMA used to maintain them, and then they passed off this responsibility to the NGS. So again, the datum needs to be the same as it is in B9 for the base flood elevation, and this is a graph from VertCon, which is now outdated, but this just kind of shows you what the differences are as you go east to west, how different it is between the two datums. And so, whoops. Okay. So the eastern half of Kansas is like 0 to 27 centimeters, which is almost 11 inches. And then on the west side, 40 to 60 centimeters, which is 9.5 inches. So a mistake like that could be pretty serious when we're talking about lowest floor elevations and compliance, as well as insurance concerns. Yeah, so I went over an example like this yesterday, but if they are different, then they have to be converted, and we want to make sure that that is correct. So it's definitely worth taking a second look at. So this is what they are using now. Through the NGS, you have the coordinate conversion and transformation tool, sorry. This is called NCAT, so it's easily available, and you can do your conversions here and then include that information in the comment section. So this is Opus that I had mentioned, the operating reference, sorry, the online positioning user service. So this is commonly used by surveyors. So these are, more technological advances that are good for surveying. So you have the space station signal that's captured by the surveyor. So again, if you use this, put that information in the elevation certificate, what station was used, attach the report. And if you're reviewing a certificate and you see a note about this, make sure you get that report with it. And the website for using this has a lot of information and advice on clear weather, waiting a day to submit things, how to calibrate the antenna, how to avoid mistakes, etc. So. Survey stakes are commonly used when they are, staking out the site, making sure that it's within the confines of the building plan. And they set out the survey stakes to know what the elevation is and for the developers to build to that elevation. There have been a few instances of them being misread, but more what we see is property owners tampering with them, so that's something to be aware of. People have pushed them further down into the ground for whatever reason, and then the floor was built too low, and that is a costly mistake to do. I don't know why you would do that to yourself, but it has happened, so that's something for surveyors to be aware of, as well as developers when they're starting to build. So once it's staked out, it should be inspected. So as a floodplain administrator, you might want to go out there with the developer and or surveyor or engineer to ensure that everything matches up with the plans. You want to check the setbacks and everything and make sure that it's where it's supposed to be. So C2A through H, again, verifying that the datum is the same as the base flood elevation, check yes or no for that. Again, where the terminology becomes important. So surveyors definitely know what the top of the bottom floor is. Applicants and property owners might not. So again, making sure that everybody's on the same page with what that means. And of course, the lowest floor is not a term that you'd find on here. That's the floodplain management term. And nothing should be left blank in this section. So if it doesn't apply to the structure, NA should be entered. And again, they have fixed that so that you can add text to these boxes. So the diagram is going to determine where the measurements are taken. So depending on what kind of foundation you have, that should match up with this information. So you should go look at the diagram and then compare it to section C and make sure that that makes sense. Like if it says there's no enclosure, but then they, take measurements for an enclosure or something. If they said it was a slab on grade, but then they, add in something that doesn't make sense, that should be looked into. Or the comments should clarify any anomalies or unusual characteristics that might make it difficult to interpret what the information is conveying. And then C2C again can be entered for diagrams 5 and 6 in any zone, and it might be helpful in a riverine floodplain. When we consider debris lines or ice jams and that historical information, we may want to see where the lowest horizontal structural member is. And technically all diagrams have a lowest horizontal structural member. Some of them may be below ground, and usually they're not really relevant unless we're looking at a 5 or 6. And then of course all the measurements should be taken in feet. So just looking through the diagram drawings, it should be maybe a little more clear now where these measurements are taken. So C2A is the bottom floor. Top of the bottom floor, that would be the top of the slab for a 1A or a 1B, which is just a raised slab. And then F through H are all always going to be site specific on what the grade is. Diagrams 2A and 2B, so the top of the bottom floor is always going to be the basement floor, and then C2B will be the next higher floor, which is usually what the living floor is, or they're both living floors either way. Diagram 3, the bottom floor would be for that split level, whatever the bottom floor is, and that's usually an enclosure. And it's, at grade, at least on one side. And then diagram 4, of course, would be the basement floor. And then the next higher floor adjacent to that, because it's a split level. Diagram 5, C2A is the elevated floor. There's no enclosure in this diagram. And then C2B, if there is a next higher floor. And then for diagram 6, the partial enclosure, obviously it's going to be the enclosure floor. C2B is above that. And then since we're looking at enclosures, A8 comes into play. So A through C for flood openings goes into the enclosure. Diagram 7 is the full story enclosure. So C2A is the enclosure floor. C2B would be the living space in most cases. And then you have A8 for the flood openings. And then this just kind of points out the different grades that would be listed in F, G, and H. Diagram 8 is your regular crawl space. So you have the flood openings, the crawl space floor, C2A, and then the floor directly above that, C2B. And then finally, you have the below grade crawl space, which is an unusual diagram, but C2A is the bottom of the subgrade crawl space. C2B is the next higher floor. And then there's these helpful drawings also in the certificate, instructions that just kind of illustrate more where to take these measurements, just breaking it down a little bit more. Just another example with the loading dock and the 1B diagram. So C2F, the lowest adjacent grade, is at the bottom of the loading dock. And then of course, any comments that would describe or explain what this is and maybe why the lag is where it is, and it's a raised slab on grade. And then this one's from our quick guide. So the attached garage, in this case, it's below the base flood elevation. It's should be wet flood proofed in that case. It's below the living structure, but it's structurally attached to that living space. And so you have the utilities elevated where you have the electrical box on the ceiling or wired from the ceiling, and then you have the water heater on a platform. And so that's another part of section C is C2E is the lowest machinery or equipment that is servicing the building. That needs to be at or above the base flood elevation. It doesn't have to be 1 foot above, but it has to be at least at or above. And that's also part of compliance that gets documented there. So F, G, and H, so that's the highest adjacent grade, lowest adjacent grade, and whatever the lowest adjacent grade is that's touching an attached deck or stairs. And so, as I mentioned, they now distinguish between finished and natural grade. So again, the lowest grade that is touching indirect contact with the foundation, that's the lowest grade. And then they define natural grade as undisturbed natural surface prior to any excavation or fill. So it hasn't been altered in any way. That's just the way the ground is naturally. And it may actually take a little bit of research to determine if it's considered natural grade or not. Zone AO, they want you to use natural grade if possible. And so you might be able to determine what the natural grade was based on grading plans or something. But if possible, you would do that and then attach source information. And if that sounds a little bit weird, the instructions do explain all of that. So the highest adjacent grade, same, the highest grade that's in direct contact with the foundation, and the same for finding any supporting source information for the AO zone. Yeah, otherwise it's just natural or finished. And then again, H, the lowest ground, sidewalk, or patio slab that's next to and touching the structurally attached deck supports or stairs that are structurally connected. And that element does count for LOMAs. So you might not necessarily be concerned for compliance reasons that it's below grade if we're just talking about support elements of a set of stairs, but FEMA will look at that for LOMAs, and they want that to also be at or above grade, just in FYI. And there can be situations where something looks structurally connected, but it's not, even if it's very close to or even touching the structure. Structurally connected means it's relying on the structural posts and house framing for support. So floating or freestanding, they're not attached, and then they wouldn't have to be included in Part H, but you'd probably want to put that in the comments or see something about that in the comments. Like if you received an elevation certificate and you see a set of stairs, but there's nothing in C2H, that would be something to clarify. So an attached deck or a ledger deck, again, would be structurally connected, or you can have it's a situation where they're adjacent to the building. Sometimes there's issues accessing the crawl space floor, and the instructions give a couple of different options to acquire that elevation. You can measure the distance from the crawl space floor from the outside to the next higher floor and then subtract that distance, or you could go from the exterior grade and measure that to the next higher floor. If you look through the vents and confirm that the interior floor is at the same elevation as the exterior grade, the floodplain administrator might have information related to this based on the original construction and permitting of that for an existing structure. Obviously, you won't have that for a new structure yet, or like it shouldn't matter for that. This is for an existing structure trying to access that area. Or the property owner might have documentation like that. And again, look through the vents as much as possible. Of course, there could always be interior access from the house. And then use section D to explain how that elevation was obtained. And then C2E, as I mentioned, is also part of compliance, the lowest machinery or equipment that is servicing the building. So before FEMA included it as a rule, people would elevate their houses on, whatever foundation, but then leave the utilities on the ground. So in this case, you can see the debris line on this HVAC system, and they were paying a lot of claims on HVAC units that were left outside on the ground like this for these utilities. So they kind of made that rule and made floodplain administrators responsible for enforcing that the utilities anywhere are at least at or above the base flood elevation. So again, we want to make sure that that is the case, and that needs to be included on the elevation certificate, no matter where it is, even if it's on the roof. Whatever that lowest equipment is goes in that section. And again, that would include underfloor ductwork. So yes, it's still a compliance issue. It would still be a violation of the regulations to just leave it on the ground like that. So again, it's at or above the base flood elevation, unless some communities do require that that equipment is elevated to the same elevation as the lowest floor. And if it's a utility that's owned by a company and not the property owner or the renter, then it doesn't count for C2E. That would be something separate that doesn't impact that person's flood insurance policy. And so it doesn't belong to them. And so that would not go on the elevation certificate. And this has gotten harder to enforce because it used to be under the legacy rating system that if you left your utilities on the floor or whatever, however low it was, that could change what your rating floor is, which could change your flood insurance premium by like 50% or something like that. And that's not the case anymore since we've had this bit of separation between insurance and floodplain management with the new rating system. So definitely something to be aware of, that it's harder to enforce a violation like this that doesn't have quite the same consequences when the person has to have insurance, but there is also a little bit of incentive with the machinery and equipment elevation discount on insurance, which are called mitigation credits. It might help. So there's that 5% discount for elevated machinery and equipment. There's also a few for proper flood venting, which is based on the other elevations, your lowest adjacent grade, first floor height, your foundation type. There's discounts for using certain building materials over other building materials, like concrete rates higher than regular wood or other materials. So you can check out the discount guide, the rating discount guide from FEMA if you're interested in that, or want to help people save money on their insurance policies, maybe. And then there's also the technical bulletin on flood openings, which again, part of the mitigation discount. And there's also statutory discounts on insurance, just a little insurance side part, but there's newly mapped procedures and the glide paths and stuff. So back to section C, there are common errors that we see, and some of these have been better handled after the new form came out and they were addressed by FEMA. So C2A could be not measured from the basement or crawl space floor, so that mistake does happen. Again, understanding what the bottom floor means. C2B for a multi-story building, that this is left blank or it's recorded as the same elevation as the bottom floor. C2C left blank instead of NA or adding a value. So most of the time that should have an NA in it, unless the surveyor is chosen to include that information. C2D is left blank, or if you leave it blank or it's not clear if there's no garage or if you just missed it, And especially if we see a garage in the photos, we're going to want to, fix that. C2E is left blank or not described in the comment section. They ask you to describe what that machinery and equipment is and where it's located. So in general, where is it located? Any electrical, heating, ventilation, plumbing, whatever that equipment is, regardless of the location, including if it's in a separate enclosure, because some structures have it in a separate enclosure. C2H with the deck or stairs is left blank when it should have a number or have NA. And as the floodplain administrator, you can require information about the ductwork to be documented, or if it's mounted to a wall or a pile, then that information can be entered by the platform elevation of where that's located. And for CRS communities, there is a new CRS checklist for this version of the form, and there's also a new memo of correctness to correct an existing elevation certificate. And there's instructions on the different methods that you can use depending on the issue that you're having. No community, whether in CRS or not, should accept an incomplete certificate. And the finished and correct elevation certificate should be conditional of issuing the certificate of occupancy. So that's often a good way of getting violations corrected is to withhold that certificate of occupancy, and then they cannot legally live there or get utilities. So until that is fixed. But this checklist and the memo of correctness, I think, is probably a best practice for communities, whether or not they're in the CRS program. So you can probably find those on crsresources.org, or I can send them to you. And then I just wanted to go into a little bit of just basic floodplain management for a few minutes as it relates to elevation certificates, because that's not the only documentation that we need. Obviously, if we're building in the floodway, it also needs a no-rise certification, which is a study analysis from an engineer that proves that it will not cause a rise in the base flood elevation, which is also signed, sealed, and dated by a registered professional engineer, so not a surveyor. An engineer has to evaluate that technical and scientific information. Just a side note, if you're new to floodplain management, structures built on fill. So often if people are using fill, their goal is to get a LOMAR F and take it out of the floodplain. FEMA has written into the community acknowledgement form that whatever is built on top of that fill pad is still going to conform with the regulations. So we need to look at that and make sure that the utilities are still elevated above the base flood elevation, and that any enclosure still has flood openings, even if it's elevated above, because that's what's required. Fill is free of construction debris. It should be a homogeneous earthen consistency. The DWR fill permit is something that's required if you're using an average of a foot or more on fill. And then there's always requirements for vegetation and sloping. So accessory structures have to have an elevation certificate, just like any other non-residential building, unless they meet the requirements for an exemption. And we've started putting these standards into all ordinances that are coming through after June 2023. It just makes permitting easier, and that way you have them specifically laid out what the requirements are. They're not habitable, they have to be anchored, have the flood openings be constructed of flood damage resistant materials, have elevated utilities, and really the presence of certain utilities will still necessitate the need for an elevation certificate. It can only be used for storage or parking, cannot be modified in the future, and it also needs to be 600 square feet or less, and it all needs to be permitted. And then all of these conditions can be documented on a permit. So flood openings, we see where they go on the elevation certificate. That information can also just be included on a permit without that. Again, as long as it's eligible for that exemption. The same for agricultural structures. If they are of single wall design, not habitable, anchored, made of flood damage resistant materials, there's no permanent retail, wholesale, or manufacturing use. They have to have a variance for this exemption, and they have to have flood openings. There's no size restrictions though, but it's only used for harvesting or drying of agricultural commodities if it's used appropriately that way. It doesn't have to have an elevation certificate. It can be exempt, but again, it does need a permit and a variance. And there's a lot of guidance out there. So FEMA has a policy on this, and then there's this full bulletin on ag and accessory structures that you can look at is very helpful. We've also started including agricultural structural language in our ordinances. So this guidance document has examples. There's more model ordinance language, and there's information on how to do a community-wide exception for all agricultural structures. And then section D. So again, there's prompts throughout the entire form, like, hey, include this in the comment section, do this, attach this. It's also in the instructions. So the supporting information for how you obtained the latitude and longitude, the device that you used, or whatever method. Describe the engineered openings. They ask you to describe that, and then attach the rating certificate for any engineered openings. And in the comments, indicate the manufacturer and the model number. If there's an effective LOMAR or another letter of map change, put the case number and the effective date of that letter that's impacting the structure, where you got the base flood elevation, that data source, the datum conversion, what software you used, attach any grading plans for how you determine natural grade in an AO zone, attach the OPUS report. You should describe the location and type of lowest machinery equipment. Again, any anomalies or unusual building characteristics that could help clarify any confusing entries. Other relevant information, again, look at the instructions, and this should never be left blank. There should always be some kind of comments describing these different things. So the signature basically puts that professional's license on the line. They could be held criminally responsible if they were to falsify any of that data, and it's punishable. And we've never had issues like that. Again, it's usually been property owners that are trying to do things that are not quite legal. But yeah, the license is on the line, and it's a crime if they were to falsify information on purpose. And then finally, we have the new sections H and I. Again, this is only for insurance purposes to determine what the first floor height is. It can be completed by anybody. It's not survey data. So it determines what the first floor height is, and then there's a yes or no checkbox for whether or not the machinery and equipment is elevated. And then section I is just the certification section where whoever has filled it out, ensures that it is accurate and they sign it. Unless you're the community official who is helping a property owner and you're taking the measurements, then you should go to section G, and then there's a place for you to check off that that's what you're using it for, and then you sign and certify that. And again, you don't have to use this section to get a policy, but if you disagree with what FEMA has come up with for your first floor height, this might help lower the premium and maybe earn some discounts depending. Again, just for insurance. So it's at the bottom where it says you'd fill out sections A and B for this purpose. And then if it's the community official, they go to section G, and then if it's the property owner, H and I, or sorry, the official just certifies in section G, and then anybody can do H and I. So only for insurance, sections A, B, and I have to be completed. So section H is preferred over section E. So AO zones, and we only use section E for AO zones, and it's more compliance related now that we have these sections. If it's just for insurance, we should use this instead of section E for first floor height. And then if section C is completed by a licensed professional, then that will take precedence over this section being filled out, or even section E being filled out. So there's just these three questions. You'll either fill out H1A or H1B depending on your building diagrams. So the above grade diagrams, as I would say, the 1A, 1B, the slabs, the 3 is the split level, and then 5 through 8 are elevated on enclosures, or 8 is the above grade enclosure. The top of the bottom floor is either is above the lowest adjacent grade by how much. And again, we're only looking at the first floor that's above grade. And then H1B is kind of the below grade diagrams. You have the 2A, 2B basement, 4 is the split level basement, 6 is the below level partial enclosure, and then 7 full story enclosure, 9 is the below grade crawl space. So you look at that diagram, and then the next higher floor above that area is what we're measuring, because that's the one that's above grade. So there's no floors below grade in this section. H1A is always at or above grade. H1B for basements and below grade crawl spaces. So the next higher floor is H1B. But if you're filling that out, leave H1A blank or put NA in there. And then lastly, H2 is the M&E elevated appropriately. Yep, yes or no. Pretty straightforward. Again, we're not doing anything crazy. We just have regular measuring instruments that we're using for the relative distance from the top of the floor to the existing lowest adjacent grade, as built grade, not surveyed. Just using a yardstick, using a tape measure, something like that. And I think it's pretty straightforward. How high off the ground is the first floor? That's all we're looking at. And then they have sorry, that's the next slide. So this is the elevation of machinery and equipment. They just kind of tell you where it has to be based on your diagram. So if it's a slab on grade, it would have to be like the next higher floor or the attic level or higher. Basement, just the floor above the basement or the floor above the crawl space. As long as it's elevated in that way, there's a diagram of all of them here. And this shows you just where to measure those things based on the diagram. So they really spell it out for you, make it pretty straightforward, as well as where your machinery and equipment have to be to get that discount. Yep. And then I think this one's from the discount guide, just a little bit more about the discounts. I've already talked about this, but yeah. And then there's other resources here. So the flood insurance manual, if you need more information about that, MT1 technical guidance, that's for letters of map change, which are common. And then like a claims manual, the Kansas Society of Land Surveyors to help property owners find a surveyor. And then that's pretty much it. We've got a couple minutes here for questions, but I have our contact information in here. And then, yeah, I'll stop sharing. Okay, so I don't see anything that's come through in the chat. But does anyone have any questions? You can come off mute. And then in the meantime, if somebody could launch the poll for the certificate. Cool. So this just lets me know if you want a certificate. I'll also send out the follow-up to everybody, which has the slides and some of the resources that we talked about today. Feel free to reach out with any questions. Anytime I can help with any permitting or reviewing of certificates. And then I can send you a certificate as long as you've been here for more than 45 minutes, or at least 45 minutes. Yeah, I can send out the recordings as well. I will still have to get these uploaded to YouTube, so it might not be until next week, but I will get those out to you. They will also be uploaded to the training page. So does it look like everyone answered?
Yeah, that looks like everyone excluding you, me, and Keegan. I'm
Cool.
gonna go ahead and close it.
All right, thanks. Well, like I said, I'll get those out to you probably sometime next week, hopefully, but I will eventually get them to you. Other than that, I hope you guys have a great day. Thanks for joining us. And again, I'm here anytime anybody has questions.